We're going to continue our discussion and talk about what Minneapolis has to do with this with Jim Ridgway, Washington Bureau Chief for the Mother Jones, and Daniel Schulman, Associate Editor of Mother Jones. And then we're going to go on to talk about Oklahoma City with Jim Ridgway and why talk about that more than a decade later. Stay with us.
Well, that's 61 highway, it belongs this road, I know. You know that 61 highway, it belongs this road, I know. She run from New York City down the Gulf of Mexico. You know some folks say the Greyhound bus don't run. You know some folks say them Greyhound buses don't run.
Highway 61, Fred McDowell here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're talking to Jim Ridgway and Daniel Schulman. They have written the piece for Mother Jones magazine called The Highwaymen, Why You Could Soon Be Paying Wall Street Investors, Australian Bankers, and Spanish Builders for the Privilege of Driving on American Roads. I want to take this back to Minneapolis and the horror that they've experienced now after the Interstate 35W bridge collapsed on Wednesday evening. Nick Coleman, in this very moving piece, Public Anger Will Follow Our Sorrow, says Minneapolis suffered a perfect storm of nightmares Wednesday evening, as anyone who couldn't sleep will tell you, including the parents who clench their jaws and tighten their hands on the wheel every time they drive a carload of strapped-in kids across a steep chasm or a rushing river. Don't panic, you tell yourself. The people in charge of this know what they're doing. They make sure the bridges stay standing, and if there were a problem, they would tell us, wouldn't they? What if they didn't? He goes on to write, the Death Bridge was structurally deficient, we now learn, and had a rating of just 50%, the threshold for replacement. But no one appears to have erred on the side of public safety. The errors were all the other way. Would you drive your kids or let your spouse drive over a bridge that had a sign saying, caution, 50% bridge ahead? Jim Ridgway, can you put what happened in Minneapolis, as they're still trying to dredge the bodies out, into context of this larger story, the larger story of highway and infrastructure privatization?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely horrible. I mean, what's going on here is that this horrible disaster is going to be used as yet one more reason to privatize all this stuff. They'll say, well, you know, we didn't have the money. These Wall Street guys will give us some money and we'll fix this decaying infrastructure. But look, what's going on in Minneapolis is exactly the same thing that happened with Katrina. What happened in Katrina is that after the storm, Bush goes down there and does his meet and greet, and then under a plan devised by Rove, they start blaming it on the states. So what happens here in Minneapolis? Yesterday, you know, we find out that this bridge was basically marked as deficient years ago, beginning 17 years ago. This is a bridge that's under the control, a highway system that's under control of the federal government, the Department of Transportation. This is a navigable river, interstate river, which is dominated by the Army Corps of Engineers. It is policed and regulated by the U.S. Coast Guard. And what happens? The president's press secretary gets up and he says, well, we told the state what to do and it's their problem. That's exactly what they did in New Orleans. That's exactly the problem here. These federal officials get away with murder. And it remains to be seen whether the members of Congress, and I'm talking about the Democratic members of Congress, have the guts, you know, to call the Secretary of Transportation and the other appropriate officials before committees in Congress and in a public session, ask them what in the world they were doing.
How much difference, Daniel Schulman, how much effect do you think this bridge collapse in Minneapolis is going to have on this trend right now? Talk about the major forces that could be held to account around the country.
It's very hard to say what type of impact this is going to have on this trend, but it's definitely picking up pace. And what I think this horrible accident did is it really highlights the fact that the nation's transportation infrastructure is crumbling, and something needs to be done. And as Jim says, hopefully this forces members of Congress to take a better look at this, because right now, you mentioned the Federal Highway Trust Fund earlier. It's going to run out of money in 2009, and not very much is being done about that. And if it does run out of money, then you're going to see this privatization trend pick up, because we're going to no longer be able to afford to keep up these interstate highways, and they will have to go into the hands of multinationals and investment banks.
Finally, Jim, before we go on to your story on Oklahoma City, what does the infrastructure of this country have to do with war, have to do with the war in Iraq?
Well, it has everything to do with the war in Iraq. I mean, first of all, we're spending all the money in Iraq, and we ought to be spending on the infrastructure. This infrastructure has been going down the slope since 1970s. There's nothing new about any of this. We've been told since the 1970s. It's been on and on and on, and no one's done anything about it, or done very little about it. The second thing is that Eisenhower knew that the infrastructure of the United States is absolutely crucial if you're going to defend yourself in a war, and we're supposedly in this war on terrorism. You know, I mean, the terrorists could attack any number of these, susceptible targets, which are scattered around the infrastructure on railways, bridges, tunnels, etc. So it's in our own, very best interest to make sure that this infrastructure of ours, which is a public endeavor after all, it's not an endeavor of Wall Street. It's something that the citizenry owns, that this is, kept up to snuff.
Well, I want to thank Daniel Schulman for joining us, editor for Mother Jones' D.C. Bureau, co-wrote the article with Jim Ridgway of The Highwaymen, Why You Could Soon Be Paying Wall Street Investors, Australian Bankers, and Spanish Builders for the Privilege of Driving on American Roads.